All right, guys, so since we are talking about Mark Twain this week, I wanted to read you a little excerpt from the book about his first novel, The Gilded Age. This might not be something you have in your book, which is especially why I'm making a video about it. And I might share a little bit with you about it while I read. So here we go. In 1873, Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner published The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The novel, Twain's first, portrays the United States as a nation consumed by greed and corruption, a land of get-rich-quick schemes, rampant speculation, and bribery. Twain and Warner filled their pages with Americans from country villagers to big city dwellers who were caught up in the fantasy of making an easy fortune, willing to sacrifice their scruples for the sake of material success. The book revealed an age that too easily mistook gilding for gold. Commercially and critically, The Gilded Age enjoyed only modest success. This isn't a book by Mark Twain that you've heard of, right? Whereas you've probably heard of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So some readers were put off by the pungent satire. Others thought the book was confused and inartistic. One reviewer compared the novel to a salad dressing badly mixed. Not the nicest thing. But Twain and Warner's contemporaries agreed that The Gilded Age had accurately captured something important, if unsettling, about the time in which they had lived. And the book shaped the way that we think about this period that we're reading about right now of American life. Even today, many historians follow Twain and Warner in referring to the late 19th century in America as the Gilded Age. Just as important, Twain and Warner's novel reveals significant trends that were emerging in the literature of the United States in the decades following the Civil War. Rather than being concerned with introspection or the perfection of literary forms, American literature in the late 19th century privileged the description and documentation of a rapidly changing society, a nation undergoing tremendous changes in terms of composition of its population, the structure of its economy, and the customs of its people. American writers scrutinized the world around them, and their observations on the page were frequently accompanied by social commentary and sometimes, as in the case of Twain, comic wit. You're going to see he's really funny, or at least he's trying to be. We'll see if you agree. Instead of the romantic idealism of antebellum authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Harriet Beecher Stowe, Gilded Age America fostered a more measured and pragmatic way of looking at the world. The role of literature, in the words of Twain's contemporary Ambrose Bierce, who we will also read next week, was to cultivate a taste for the distasteful, to endeavor to see things as they are, not as they ought to be. Labels for literary and cultural periods offer a convenient shorthand for characterizing the complicated reality of any cultural movement. We use them, usually with the benefit of hindsight, to reduce the chaos of the past to some kind of narrative order. You will see that we do that this semester as we learn. For most of the 20th century, literary histories of the Gilded Age celebrated American authors for their willingness to present a series of increasingly distasteful truths, particularly through novels depicting the excess and foibles of the urban environments, where new fortunes were being won and lost. Mark Twain, Henry James, Stephen Crane, Edith Wharton, and Theodore Dreiser, all authors included in this volume, were recognized as writers who advanced an aesthetic of realism. Now, realism is something that we are going to talk about in depth this semester. The editor and author William Dean Howells was identified as the leading proponent of this movement, something you need to remember. And literary historians carefully analyzed his advocacy in the pages of specifically his magazines like Atlantic Monthly and Harper's. During the last 3 decades, scholars of American literature have been concerned that this period in American literature has been too narrowly defined. They have noted how one defines what is real depends on where one sits in society, and that the authors named above were largely located in the nation's urban centers, where they focused on I lost my place. where they have focused primarily on the lives of native-born whites. Scholars have also observed that editors like Howells were in fact interested in cultivating a wider variety of perspectives, including authors from regions across the United States, immigrant writers, and African American authors. If one of the roles of literature is to see things as they are, then our definition of literature could also expand beyond fiction and poetry to include other forms of writing, such as autobiography, sketches, and folktales that proliferated during this period. Literature, though, does not merely show how things are. It amuses, provokes, cajoles, and inspires. Twain was one of the fiercest critics of his time, but he was also one of its finest entertainers. His writing not only reflected the world that surrounded him, but it also played a significant role in shaping how his readers, including us today, understand the world that he lived in. The realism that flourished between the Civil War and World War I raises as many questions about the purpose of literature as it answers. How should literature respond to the social problems of its time? How can language capture what is real? Who gets to decide what counts as realism and what counts as fantasy? How can literature help us to understand competing perspectives on reality? These questions remain as pertinent in our time as they were in Twain's. Many of the changes sweeping through Twain's world seem to foreshadow the struggles of our own time. The period encompassing the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th witnessed an influx of immigrants to America, questions about racial equality and racial violence, anxiety about shifting gender roles, and concerns about the accumulation and concentration of wealth. The distance between the late 19th century and the present is substantial, and the differences between that period and ours are significant. But there are good reasons that some have called the early 21st century a second Gilded Age. Okay, so that's a little bit about the age that we are reading from right now. We're reading authors that are from this Gilded Age. This Gilded Age was identified and defined first by Mark Twain, and we are reading him first because he is what is known as our first famous author. He is our first entertainer. He is our first humorist, our first satirist. And we may not think that you'll have to make up your mind on your own to see if you think that he is the greatest of all time. But even if you don't think he's the greatest of all time, he is the first that gains the type of recognition that he does. And he plays a really big role in defining that this time in America is the Gilded Age, and that we need to focus on things like how the world really is in our literature instead of portraying a fantasy of how it ought to be. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions here, and I want you to answer those after you watch this video. First, I want you to tell me, who is the creator of realism? That is something I said in this video. Second, I want to ask you, what is Mark Twain's first novel? All right. Third, I want to ask you, name one example of an author who used the romantic idealism style of writing. All right, I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching.